animals and, the smells that go along with it. And he said, here's the greatest leader that ever walked this planet, coming from the humblest of beginnings. And I turned to Connie, who was sitting next to me. I said, well, that's the total opposite of Jeff, who's my boss. Because in my eyes, I didn't see a whole lot of humility in him. And she just laughed. And I flipped my bulletin over, and this is going to sound strange, but this is what happened. I just kept writing and writing and writing, and I couldn't stop. And I just found myself writing this outline, and then I got this overwhelming thought in my head that there's a book here. And I remember like it was yesterday, driving home with Connie, and I turned to her and I said, I think God wants me to write a book. And she was like, what? I mean, because that was not even on my radar screen. I had no dream of doing that at all. Well, I ended up, after I left the company, which I'm going to talk about in a second, I ended up writing this book where I took my boss's leadership style, contrasted it with the great leaders of the Bible. And that book's called Leadership, Biblical First Aid for Leaders, and that ended up getting published in 2005, and that really changed the whole trajectory of my life. So that was in early December when I heard from God about that. Well, 2 weeks later, on a Sunday night, we were sitting at our home group down in the basement of one of our members' houses. And our leader decided that night to do a study about the phrase, fear not, and how many times that appears in the Bible. And so we had this great study that night. And then he said, we're going to do something a little bit different. He pulled an ottoman in the middle of the floor, and he said, we're going to ask anyone who wants to be prayed for to come sit on this ottoman, and we're going to lay hands on you and pray for them. Now, keep in mind, this is like the 4th or 5th time that Connie and I were in this group. So we're just kind of getting to know everybody. I had never had anything or been a part of anything like this where people laid hands on everybody and prayed for them. So I thought this is a little bit strange, but it also sounds kind of cool. So a guy in our group volunteers and he goes first, so we all lay hands on him and pray for him. Well, then I said, I'd like prayer. So I sat down on the ottoman, and everyone laid hands, and they said, what do you need prayer for? I said, I really need to hear from God of whether or not I'm supposed to leave this job or whether I'm supposed to stay. I need to hear from him, and I need to hear from him soon. Well, I had taken 2 weeks off during that time, the previous week and the next week leading up to Christmas, because I really wanted to quiet my mind, I really wanted to hear from God, and I really needed to recharge my batteries. So everyone started praying simultaneously. It was this amazing experience. Well, the next morning I wake up and I'm going to run a few errands. And so I'm getting ready to walk out the door, and I get a call from Ellen, my assistant. And she says, Jim, Jeff needs you on a conference call at 11 o'clock, and it's now 10:30. And I said, well, Ellen, tell Jeff I can't make it. I'm on vacation, and I've got some things I got to do. She said, well, Jeff said it's mandatory. You've got to be on this call. I was like, okay, great. Who's going to be on the call, and what's it about? She goes, I'm really sorry. I don't know who's going to be on it or what it's about. I said, okay, fine. So I went out the door, and I started running some errands, and I found myself in a parking lot downtown outside this building that I needed to go into. And I make the call at 11 o'clock. And there were 4 guys on my team there, and apparently they had done some things to really upset my boss the previous week while I was on vacation. So for that next 45 minutes, it was all about bashing Jim. It was just all about, he told me about 73 different ways or reasons why I was a worthless human being, 4-letter words, the whole deal, for 45 minutes, literally. And I just sat there and took it. And as soon as it was over, I hung up the phone, and I looked to heaven, and I said, thank you, Lord. You just showed me what I needed to do. Without a question of a doubt in my mind, I knew God was telling me I needed to leave the company because I was on vacation, wasn't supposed to be on this call, knew nothing about it, yet God had orchestrated it for me to be on there. Well, once I kind of came to that realization that, okay, my time is short with the company, then reality started to set in. I started to think, well, wait a minute. The bills aren't going to stop when I quit my job. I'm making this great income over here. God, I don't think you'd really ask me to leave this great income and not be able to provide for my family and not do all this stuff. So I really started to have a lot of doubt. But fortunately, God had placed people in my life, including my wife, who was dead set. She really felt that I was supposed to leave my job. And then I had other people surrounding me as well, who I sought their counsel, and they said, no, I really think God's telling you that you need to leave. So on January 4th of 2004, I quit. And they asked me to stay around for about a month to kind of help with the transition, which I did. And when I quit, I've got to tell you, I thought I had an idea of what was in my future from a career perspective. But none of those things materialized. And I've found out now that that's exactly how God works. He will not show us the whole plan. And he really, truly does lead us into this crisis of belief, and that's right where I was. And when we step into it, it may seem like stuff's never going to happen, or it may seem like it's not going the way that it's supposed to. So for me, that was the front end of a 7-year desert experience in my life, mostly from a financial perspective. That very first year in 2004, if you looked at my income tax return, you would see $0 of net income. In addition to that, I now needed to pay for my own health insurance for the first time in my life. So I felt like this colossal failure because everything about success was about finances and achievement to me. So I had just tons of doubt going through my mind. I questioned myself a lot. I questioned God a ton during this time. But looking back on it, I can see now how God was just so faithful and has been so faithful through this to me. And also looking back, I can see why he needed to take me through this 7-year period, because frankly, I needed a lot, or I had to learn a lot. Probably the primary area where I needed to learn some things was that money was not my God. You see, I thought my security had to do with money. That's how I was raised, and that's just what my belief system was. So God needed to break that off of me, and he needed to take away my income in order for me to get that, and it took a while. And I'd love to tell you, by the way, that I've got this figured out, but God continually brings lessons along this line to me, so I know he's not done teaching me about this. The other area that we really needed to learn was in the area of our marriage. We had a marriage that was not very God-honoring. I was not the leader that God needed to be in our home. And he needed to correct that. And through that process, our marriage has been tested like at no other point in our lives. And it's still being tested today. So we have gone through counseling, we're going through counseling now. But God has been so faithful in bringing not only counselors to us, but great friends, couples who are walking through this with us. And we're just so thankful for that. And though it is painful at times, I'm telling you, we both are extremely thankful because we know this is making us better. But perhaps the toughest part of all of this for me was that after I quit my job, very few people understood what I was going through. And when I tried to explain it, quite frankly, they thought I was nuts. So it was a very, very lonely time for me. But I look back over this time and I see how God did some amazing things for me to encourage me at just some very well-timed moments. You know, I mentioned our life groups, and those were huge because they were praying for me, encouraging me along the way. And the home group that I talked about earlier, about 1 to 2 years into it for me, it was Super Bowl Sunday. And they brought in a gal who's a friend of theirs from Wasion, who has this amazing experience going with God, just where she has obeyed God and stepped into the river, and God's doing some amazing things around her and through her and her husband. Well, she and her husband came and shared with us just these amazing stories that were just so encouraging to me. And she talked about some of her hardships, which really resonated with me, and then the stuff that God was doing was really cool. But the thing that really got me is after she was done, we got introduced for the first time. And she said something really strange to me. She goes, "Jim, would it be okay if I shared with you what the Lord's been saying to me about you during this time together?" And I'm like, a little freaked out, but I said, "Sure." And this is the first time this has ever happened to me. And she began speaking these things to me that I had never heard before, but they were things that just agreed with my spirit, and they were so encouraging. And she had has what I have now come to find out is a prophetic gift. And I have quite a few of these prophetic people around me now, which really encourage me along this journey. But the things that she told me, it's amazing, are exactly the things that I'm doing today that I had no idea about. So that was very encouraging. Another time, around that time, maybe a year later, I was taking communion, again in our old building at Crossroads. I think it was a Wednesday night. And we were taking this time, and I was just in this depressed state, just really unsure about everything. And so we were taking communion. I remember I was praying with my head in my hands, kind of bent over. And I was saying, you know, God, did I miss you totally? Did I totally not hear you correctly? Did I make the biggest mistake of my life and hurt my family in the process here? God, will you please show me that you're still with me? Will you show me that I'm on the right path? Will you show me that you still love me? And I mean, the moment I finished that prayer, I kid you not, I get kissed on the top of my head, literally kissed. I'm startled, and I look up, and it's Buck Miller, who many of you probably know. Buck was in our home group and is perhaps the godliest man, or one of the godliest men that I know. He and his wife Linda now live in Alabama, but I looked up at him, and he just smiled the smile at me, and I just lost it. I just broke out in tears in that moment because I knew that God was answering my prayer, that I was on the right path, and he was just encouraging me in that moment. And I have to tell you, I had forgotten all about that moment until about 4 weeks ago, sitting right out here, we were taking communion. And God just brought that to my mind and my heart. I mean, I felt it. It was like I was there in that moment, and I was over here bawling. It was that emotional for me. That was that impactful to me during that time. Other things that would happen is every now and then I'd read a story in the Bible that would really resonate with me and make me feel like, man, he's going through the same exact thing that I'm going through. One of those people was Moses. You know, as Dean mentioned 2 weeks ago, he gets word from God in his burning bush that he's to lead the Israelites out of captivity, out of Egypt, into the promised land. So he steps into that, and he starts on his way, and he runs into obstacle after obstacle, roadblock after roadblock, and he had to be wondering, God, did I miss you? Did I not hear you correctly? Because it just doesn't seem like it's going the way it's supposed to go here. So in that moment, I said, man, that is exactly how I feel. And you know what? Here's the really cool part. Those stories in the Bible are there for that very reason. They're there because we're going to go through the same exact stuff that our biblical heroes did. They're just people like you and me. Ordinary, everyday people who had these experiences, and the same thing can happen for us and will happen for us. So though this time for me has been extremely difficult at times and still is difficult now to some degree, I have to tell you, I would not trade it for anything in the world. Because I need to bring you up to date on my story. You know, I told you about the book, and that led me to begin writing a monthly newsletter/magazine for Christian business owners and doctors to place in their offices for their patients or their employees to really encourage and minister to them. So I've been doing that for about 5.5 years, and that's been a lot of fun and been a neat little business for me. And the name of that is 5 feet 20, because that's how tall I am, or how tall I tell people I am. And so that's been fun. And that led me 3.5 years ago to start another business here in Toledo called Truth at Work. And Truth at Work is an organization that works with Christian business and ministry leaders in a roundtable setting of 12 to 15 peers to gather together to really act as a board of advisors to one another, to encourage each other to grow their organizations in a God-honoring way, while at the same time growing personally and spiritually. And I have to tell you, I've seen miraculous things happen in these groups, and I just feel so blessed to be able to be a part of it. I've seen miraculous things in families, individuals, and businesses. I'm now also doing some other things inside companies, especially with some of our members, where we're working to help teach some life skills to employees, which has been a lot of fun as well and very, very encouraging. In addition, I'm just finishing up a new book it's about finding peace in the midst of this chaotic world. I've been working on it for 2 years, and I'm very excited about it. And I just wanted to share that stuff with you because not one of those things did I know about back in 2003 when God asked me to leave my job. So when I look through, and survey the path that I've been walking and survey what God has done in my life and is going and doing around me, I just marvel at his work. I truly feel like the most blessed person on the planet. And the reason I think that is because I'm walking, I believe, much more closely with what God has purposed for my life. And as a result, I'm much more fulfilled. I'm not making as much money as I made before, not even close. But I'm telling you, I wouldn't trade it. And by the way, I am not trying to share with you how perfect my life is, because it is so far from perfect. I mean, I could have very easily have shared with you the times where I missed it with God. Well, at least the times that I know I missed it with God. But I hope this has been encouraging to you to know that God really does speak, and he wants to speak to you. I also hope that if you have taken a step of faith, that this has encouraged you. Maybe you're in a place where you're thinking, man, this just isn't working the way it's supposed to. I'm feeling like I'm crazy here. Well, maybe this could be an encouragement to you that you are on the right path and you aren't crazy. Well, just to summarize some key points, and I've got an outline in the bulletin there. If you want to follow along here, we're going to go through these fairly quickly. But if you want to write these in, it might be helpful to you. You know, I was very young in my Christian walk when God spoke to me about the book and then also about leaving my job. So the key point there is you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be this seasoned Christian to hear from God. You do not have to have it figured out in order to hear from God. The other thing is God still does speak today, and you can hear him, especially if you make yourself available. So if you make yourself available, you can hear him because he does speak. The other thing is he may ask you to do some things that seem really scary at times and don't make sense. So he'll do some things that don't make sense and ask you to do some things that don't make sense. The other thing is, even though that's going on, he's not going to reveal the whole plan to you because he wants to build your faith. Because he wants you to respond to his voice even if it doesn't make sense. So he will not reveal the whole plan to you in advance, and he wants you to respond to his voice even if it doesn't make sense because he wants to build your faith. And this may be the key point. He does all of this because he truly knows what is best for you, and he has your best interest at heart. You know, I heard about this mountain climber who was a pretty accomplished climber, and he had dreamt his whole life of scaling this peak that was within driving distance of his house. And so all of a sudden he decided the time was here for him to begin training for this. So he put in 2 years of training to get the endurance and the strength needed to make it to the top of the summit. And on the day of his climb, he got out there right at dawn, and he had all his gear, all his equipment, and he was by himself. He wanted to climb this all by himself to prove that he could do it all by himself. So he began the ascent up the top of this cliff, and things were going along absolutely great. And the daylight kept on going, or the day kept on going, and as he got 100 meters from the top, he began to panic a little bit because he realized that he had misjudged how long it was going to take him to get to the top. And he was starting to run out of daylight. So it was getting darker and darker each moment he proceeded on. Well, he pressed on, determined to make it to the top. And it got darker every minute he went up. Well, then he had to reach over with his foot to grab a toehold on something, and he slipped. And he began falling through the air, falling backwards. And as he was falling, he just had a flood of emotions and a flood of memories just come into his mind. And he knew he was going to die. Well, moments later, a jolt about ripped him in two, and he realized with great relief that he had tied a safety harness, a rope, attached to a belt, which broke his fall. So there he lay dangling in the pitch stillness of the night. He had no idea how far off the ground he was. And so he cried out for God. He said, God, will you help me? And all of a sudden God's voice says, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, save me, God. And God says, well, do you really think I can save you? He goes, yes, my Lord. I know you can save me. So then God says, okay, by your faith, take your knife out of your pocket and cut your rope. Dead silence. Well, it's reported the next morning that the rescue team found a frozen mountain climber attached to the end of a rope.